The camper who woke up to a bear sleeping next to him. Part 1. A Night in the Wilderness. The forest was alive with the soft whispers of the night. Crickets chirped in rhythmic harmony. The wind rustled through the dense canopy of pines. And somewhere in the distance, the gentle gurgling of a stream added to the peaceful ambience. The stars above cast a faint glow over the wilderness, barely penetrating the thick cover of trees. Liam Parker had spent countless nights in the great outdoors, but this camping trip felt different. He had chosen a remote spot deep in the Appalachian wilderness, miles away from the nearest town. Solitude was what he sought, an escape from the digital world, the noise, the never-ending responsibilities of modern life. Out here, alone with his thoughts, he felt at peace. His campsite was simple. A small fire crackled a few feet away from his one-person tent, illuminating the immediate area with a flickering warmth. His backpack, filled with supplies, rested against a nearby tree. After a long day of hiking, his body ached for rest. Yawning, Liam put out the fire, leaving only the faint glow of embers behind. He crawled into his sleeping bag, zipping himself snugly inside. The air was crisp but not unbearably cold, and soon, exhaustion overtook him. The sounds of the forest faded as he drifted into sleep. Hours passed. Then, something changed. A weight, a presence. Liam stirred slightly, shifting in his sleep, but something felt off. His subconscious registered it before his waking mind did. The sensation of warmth pressed against his side. Something solid and breathing. His eyes fluttered open. The darkness inside the tent was thick, but the moment his senses fully awakened, his blood ran cold. Something was lying right next to him. Something big. Something that breathed in deep, steady rhythms. Liam's heart pounded in his chest. He could feel the warmth of fur, the slow expansion and contraction of a massive body pressing against his sleeping bag. He could hear it, a low, deep, unmistakable sound. A bear was sleeping right beside him, paralyzed by fear. Liam's breath caught in his throat. His mind screamed at him to move, to run, to do anything but lie there like prey. But his body refused to obey. Every instinct told him that the slightest movement could wake the animal. And if that happened, he swallowed hard. He needed to think. The tent was zipped shut. His knife was in his backpack outside. His bear spray was tucked into his jacket on the far side of his sleeping bag, completely out of reach. He was trapped. The bear's breathing was slow and even, indicating deep sleep. It hadn't come crashing into his tent in aggression. It had crawled inside, laid down, and fallen asleep. But why? Liam's brain struggled to make sense of it. Had it been drawn by his body heat? Had it been seeking shelter from the cold? Had the lingering scent of food on his gear attracted it? None of it mattered now. The only thing that mattered was getting out alive. He resisted the overwhelming urge to panic. If the bear was asleep, he still had a chance. If he could somehow inch away without waking it, he might be able to unzip the tent and escape. But the slightest twitch sent a ripple through the bear's fur, and Liam froze as it shifted, letting out a low grunt. For a terrifying moment, he thought it was waking up. He clenched his jaw, barely breathing, waiting for the inevitable. But the bear just adjusted its position, exhaling heavily, sinking deeper into sleep. Liam's pulse thundered in his ears. He was trapped in a tent with a sleeping bear, and if he made one wrong move, that sleep might not last much longer. Part 2. A Silent Escape. Liam's breath was shallow, his entire body frozen with fear. His mind raced with one singular thought. How do I get out of this alive? The black bear beside him shifted slightly, letting out a deep, sleepy exhale. Its massive body radiated warmth, its fur brushing against the thin fabric of Liam's sleeping bag. The sheer weight of the animal pressed into the ground beside him, making any sudden movement a potential disaster. Liam's instincts told him to stay absolutely still. Any sudden movement could startle the bear, and if that happened, there was no telling how it would react. He slowly shifted his gaze toward the entrance of his tent. The zipper, it was his only way out, but the sound of unzipping the tent could easily wake the bear. He had to be silent. A careful plan. Liam's hands trembled as he inched them toward the zipper. He gritted his teeth, trying to control his breathing. Every tiny movement felt like an eternity. He grasped the metal tab, feeling the coolness of it against his fingertips. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, he began to pull it down. Zzz. The bear stirred. Liam's breath caught in his throat as the bear let out a low, rumbling sound. Not a growl, just a deep sigh. Its ears twitched, but its eyes remained closed. He waited, heart hammering against his ribs. Did it notice? Did it care? After what felt like an eternity, the bear's breathing returned to its deep, rhythmic pattern. Liam continued, even slower this time, inch by inch. The moment of truth. He finally managed to unzip the tent just enough to squeeze through. The cool night air hit his face, a stark contrast to the warmth of the bear beside him. He carefully extracted one leg, moving as smoothly as possible to avoid disturbing the ground beneath them. Then, disaster struck. His foot snagged on the sleeping bag. For a split second, he lost his balance, his knee pressing into the earth with a faint but noticeable thud. The bear shifted again. This time, its massive head lifted slightly. Liam held his breath, his entire body going rigid. Don't move. Don't breathe. Don't exist. The bear blinked lazily, sniffed the air, and then, in a moment that defied all logic, it yawned. A long, slow yawn, its enormous jaws stretching wide before it smacked its lips and nestled back down. Liam almost collapsed in relief. Freedom in sight. Realizing he had no second chances, he moved faster this time, but still controlled. His torso slipped out of the tent, his hands pressing into the damp earth as he pulled himself free. His heart pounded as his feet followed, the cool night air wrapping around his body like a long-awaited embrace. Finally, he was out, crouched in the darkness. Liam turned to see the tent behind him. The bear was still there, still curled up, still breathing steadily. He had escaped, but now, a new problem presented itself. His gear was still inside the tent. His bear spray, his phone, his boots, and there was no way in hell he was going back in to get them. Liam swallowed hard, stepping backward toward the nearby trees, his bare feet pressing against the cold forest floor. He needed to think. He needed a plan, but mostly, he needed to get as far away as possible before that bear decided to wake up for real. Part 3. Between fear and curiosity. Liam's breath formed clouds in the cold night air as he crouched behind a tree, his heart still hammering from the silent escape he had just pulled off. His hands trembled, and not just from the cold. He had just survived waking up next to a bear, but the situation was far from over. His boots, his bear spray, his supplies, all still inside the tent. Liam glanced back toward the small clearing where his tent stood. The dim moonlight barely illuminated the outline of the sleeping bear, still nestled in his tent as if it were a cozy den. How was it still asleep? He had expected it to wake up the moment he moved, but somehow, it had remained completely unfazed. His mind was split between two instincts: run as far as possible and never look back, or find a way to retrieve his gear. Neither option was particularly comforting. A dangerous decision. Liam's bare feet were freezing against the damp forest floor. The adrenaline of his escape had masked the cold at first, but now the chill was creeping in. He wouldn't last long without proper footwear, and without his bear spray, he was defenseless. He took a slow breath, forcing himself to think logically. The bear hadn't been aggressive. That fact alone was strange enough. If it had wanted to attack, it would have done so when he was trapped inside with it. Instead, it had simply slept. That meant he had time, a chance. Liam knew that waking a sleeping bear was one of the most dangerous things a person could do. But if he was careful, if he was slow, methodical, and quiet, he might be able to get what he needed and get out. Or it could wake up and maul him. He sighed. Great choices. Back into the den. Every step back toward the tent felt like a test of his nerves. He kept his breath steady, moving across the forest floor as silently as possible. His pulse pounded with every inch he closed between himself and the sleeping giant. At the entrance of the tent, he crouched low, peering inside. The bear hadn't moved. Its massive frame rose and fell with each slow breath, its thick fur slightly rustling with the movement. Liam swallowed hard. His backpack was just inside, only a few feet from the bear's back paws. His boots were near the entrance. An easy grab, but the bear spray? That was deeper in, too close to the bear's head. He carefully reached for his boots first, gripping them tightly and pulling them toward him with painstaking slowness. No sudden movements, no noise. His fingers closed around the laces. Then the bear shifted. Liam's stomach clenched as the massive creature let out a deep, rumbling sigh and turned slightly onto its side. He froze, his breath trapped in his chest. A long moment passed. The bear exhaled again and stayed asleep. Liam let out a shaky breath, barely believing his luck. A close call. With his boots now in hand, he carefully slipped them on, suppressing a sigh of relief as the warmth returned to his feet. That alone gave him some confidence, but he still needed his bear spray. He leaned forward just slightly, reaching for his bag, when the bear's ears twitched. Liam went rigid. The bear's nose twitched next, sniffing the air in slow, deliberate breaths. Then, its eyes fluttered open. Liam stopped breathing. This was it. The bear lifted its head slightly, blinking as it looked around groggily. For a terrifying moment, its gaze locked onto Liam. Liam's mind screamed at him to stay still. The bear stared, curious, uncertain, not aggressive, not fearful, just studying him. Then, the most bizarre thing happened. The bear huffed, smacked its lips, and laid back down. Liam blinked. What? It had seen him. It had acknowledged him. But instead of reacting with fear or aggression, it had simply gone back to sleep. What kind of bear was this? A new understanding. Liam didn't dare waste another second. He reached forward, grabbed his bag, and slowly backed away from the tent. Every movement felt surreal, like he was navigating a dream that made no sense. Once he was several yards away, he finally exhaled a long, shaky breath. He had done it. His gear was with him. His boots were on, and the bear, somehow, was still inside his tent, as if it had simply decided to stay. Liam shook his head, trying to make sense of it. He had always respected nature, always understood that wildlife had its own rhythms. But this was beyond anything he had ever imagined. Maybe this bear had been around humans before. Maybe it was unusually comfortable with people. Or maybe, just maybe, it had simply chosen to trust him. Either way, one thing was clear. Liam wasn't running anymore. He had survived the night. But now, he had a different question on his mind. Was the bear planning to leave? Or had it just decided to stay? Part 4. A strange coexistence. Liam sat a safe distance from the tent, staring at the silhouette of the bear still curled up inside. His mind raced with questions, each one more baffling than the last. Why was it still there? The logical part of his brain told him to pack up and leave. He had his gear, his boots were on, and he wasn't trapped anymore. He could get out of here while the bear was still in its lethargic state. But something kept him rooted in place. The bear wasn't acting normal. Bears didn't just fall asleep next to humans and stay. If it had smelled food, it would have torn through his supplies by now. If it were sick, it would be restless. But instead, it was simply resting. Liam's heart was still racing, but curiosity had started to outweigh his fear. Slowly, cautiously, he moved a little closer to the tent, crouching low. He wasn't trying to be reckless, but he needed to see if the bear was truly asleep or just pretending to be. He picked up a small twig from the ground and, holding his breath, gently tossed it toward the tent. The twig bounced off the fabric with a faint sound. The bear's ears twitched. Liam froze. The bear let out a deep sigh but didn't move. He exhaled. It was still comfortable, establishing boundaries. Liam needed a plan. He wasn't about to share his tent with a bear indefinitely, but he also wasn't about to make a stupid move that could provoke it. Instead of doing anything drastic, he decided to establish some space. He gathered some of his food supplies and, making sure to stay far from the tent, he placed a small portion of granola and a piece of dried meat about 20 feet away in the open. Then, he backed away and waited. Minutes passed. The morning sun had started to filter through the trees. casting golden light over the clearing. The bear remained inside the tent for a long while, stretching once or twice but not getting up. Then, at last, it rose to its feet. Liam's entire body tensed as the bear yawned and stretched its massive limbs, its claws extending slightly before retracting. It was a slow, lazy movement, not one of aggression. The bear sniffed the air, its black nose twitching as it caught the scent of the food Liam had set out. It turned its head toward Liam, a long stare. Liam held his breath. The moment stretched between them, heavy with tension. Then, finally, the bear lumbered out of the tent. A surprising exit. The bear ambled toward the food Liam had placed down, sniffing it cautiously before lapping up the granola. It chewed lazily, making soft chuffing sounds. Liam watched in awe. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't panicking. It was just existing. And then, just as casually as it had arrived, the bear began walking away. Liam stayed perfectly still, watching as the massive creature lumbered toward the trees. Taking slow, deliberate steps, every few feet, it would pause, sniff the air, and then continue. Liam realized that he was holding his breath. Finally, as the bear reached the tree, it stopped one last time. It turned its head back toward Liam, staring for a long, unreadable moment. Then, with a deep, slow exhale, it disappeared into the forest. Liam didn't move for several minutes. His brain was still processing everything that had just happened. A bear had shared his tent. A bear had slept next to him. A bear had chosen to leave peacefully. It was something out of a storybook, something no one would believe. His instincts told him to pack up and leave before anything else happened. But deep down, another feeling was creeping in. Something had changed. Liam had just experienced one of the most unusual encounters of his life. And somehow, he felt a strange sense of connection with the bear. He didn't know if he'd ever see it again. But if he did, he wasn't sure he'd be afraid anymore. Part 5. A Memory That Lasts. Liam sat in the clearing, watching the spot where the bear had disappeared into the thick forest. The silence that followed was almost deafening. His body still hummed with adrenaline. But instead of fear, he felt something else, awe. The encounter had been surreal. A wild bear had not only entered his tent, but had chosen to sleep beside him, peacefully, as if it had never considered him a threat. And now, just as calmly as it had arrived, it had left, disappearing into the wilderness. Liam exhaled, shaking his head in disbelief. How do you explain this to someone? Would anyone believe him? Or would they laugh and call him crazy? He wasn't even sure if he fully believed it himself. Packing up, moving on. After a long moment of reflection, Liam knew he had to move. The sun had fully risen, casting golden light over the forest. And he didn't want to push his luck by lingering too long in a place where a bear had felt comfortable enough to sleep beside him. Slowly, he approached his tent. The bear's scent lingered in the fabric, a musky, earthy aroma that filled his nostrils as he carefully inspected the interior. Everything seemed intact, his gear, his supplies. Only the indentation in the ground where the bear had slept remained as proof of the bizarre encounter. He packed his things swiftly, still half expecting the bear to reappear. But it never did. As he hoisted his backpack onto his shoulders, he took one last glance around the clearing. The memory of the night before was already beginning to feel like something out of a dream, a story too wild to be true, yet too vivid to forget. With a deep breath, he turned and started down the trail. The weight of an experience. As Liam hiked through the dense forest, his mind replayed every detail of the night before. The initial terror, the slow realization that the bear wasn't there to harm him, the strange, silent connection they had shared. It all felt like something out of a nature documentary rather than real life. He had always respected nature, but now, that respect had deepened into something more profound. He had shared space with one of the most powerful creatures in the wild, and it had chosen peace. That meant something. Liam wasn't sure what, but he knew he would never look at the wilderness the same way again. A story to tell. By the time Liam reached civilization, his mind was made up. He had to tell this story. At a small roadside diner, over a cup of hot coffee, he recounted the night to an older couple seated next to him. They listened with wide eyes, hanging on to every word. By the time he finished, the husband let out a long whistle. "Well, son," he said, shaking his head, "that might just be the craziest campfire story I've ever heard." Liam laughed. "Yeah," he admitted. "I wouldn't believe it myself if I hadn't lived it." The wife leaned forward, curiosity shining in her eyes. "Do you think the bear will come looking for you again?" Liam paused at the question. He had thought about it. Would the bear remember him? Would it associate him with safety? With warmth? "I don't know," he said honestly. "But if it does, I don't think I'd be afraid." A final thought. Days later, back home, Liam found himself staring at his camping gear, the smell of the bear still faintly lingering on his tent. He ran a hand over the fabric, smiling to himself. Some experiences changed a person. Some moments stayed with you forever. This was one of those moments. And if he ever returned to that forest, part of him hoped, just maybe, he'd see his unexpected camping companion again.